Aid is finally getting through to Gaza from Egypt. US President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreed that these deliveries will continue. Over the weekend, at least 34 trucks carrying aid entered the Gaza Strip. Meanwhile, Israel launched limited raids into Gaza overnight, and airstrikes targeting Hamas are also continuing.
Israeli airstrikes hit a house in central Gaza Strip Sunday afternoon. Reports say at least 6 people were killed. The injured are rushed to the hospital as neighbors and medics dug to find survivors. In Rafah, in southern Gaza, many homes were also hit by Israeli strikes.
10 houses were destroyed, with children between 2 and 5 years old. Were they fighters? If they're looking for fighters, they're on the borders, not in safe zones.
Israel has stepped up its bombardment of Gaza, saying it's hitting targets connected to Hamas terrorists and other militant groups.
To the residents of Gaza City and north of Gaza City, you see that we intensified our attacks and we will continue acting like that. So move south.
A request many have heeded, but even the south isn't safe from Israeli strikes. The UN says over 60% of Gaza's population has been displaced, and many are taking refuge in camps like these, lacking basic facilities. Civilians face widespread shortages of clean water, fuel, medicines, and food. In the southern city of Khan Yunis, people have to wait for hours to buy bread.
We've been here at the bakery's door since dawn. Only God knows our suffering. If the situation continues the same way for 2 or 3 more days, it will be a catastrophe in the Gaza Strip. Children are starving. We ask all countries and nations to look at us with some humanity.
Trucks carrying basic supplies have finally reached Gaza from Egypt, but the aid falls far short of what is needed.
The most urgent needs at the moment are fuel, water, food and medicine. Why fuel? Because fuel is used to produce water in Gaza. There is no drinking water in Gaza, and fuel is used to run the desalination plants. So it's very, very, very important. And so far, no fuel has been allowed into Gaza.
And without more urgently needed supplies, the humanitarian crisis can only get worse.
And earlier, we asked Shaina Loh from the Norwegian Refugee Council for her assessment of whether Gaza will continue to receive aid in the near term.
Well, I saw news this evening that from the U.S. that sounds like they're very hopeful that starting tomorrow, aid will be delivered more regularly into Gaza. It couldn't come at a more dire moment. People are really struggling just to get basic necessities, bread, water, medicines. And so I'm hopeful that this news will prove to be true and that we will be seeing more regular convoys and also a huge scaling up of these convoys. We've seen about 37 trucks be able to go in over the last 2 days. The UN has said at minimum we need 100 trucks of humanitarian assistance in order to reach the 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza's basic needs.
Amidst that need, the Hamas-controlled health ministry in Gaza claimed at least 4,600 people have died and 3 times as many wounded during Israeli bombing. My colleague Claire Richardson put that number to Israeli military spokesperson Peter Lerner for a response.
Hamas's propaganda ministry of health says that. We need to be very, very cautious at accepting, I would say even relying on any sources coming out of Gaza, specifically Hamas's ministries. So I won't suggest that there is any reason to actually comment on what Hamas is saying. Indeed, we are conducting strikes against Hamas.
Do you have a different number for us?
No, I would not even comment on that number. I would say there is a reality on the ground in Gaza where Hamas has pre-positioned its capabilities within the civilian arena. When they put explosive drones on the roofs of housetops, they are jeopardizing those housetops. We are operating within the realm of the laws of armed conflict. We are calling for people to evacuate areas to get them out of harm's way as a temporary measure. And Hamas is trying to keep them in harm's way and sacrifice them.
Okay.
So while you weigh on and accept for face value what Hamas is telling you because of these numbers, we need to be very, very cautious, because this is an organization that has no problem in butchering babies in their bedrooms. So why would they have a problem in lying to the world media?
Meanwhile, regional rival Iran is certainly commenting on the situation. Its Foreign Minister Hossein Amir Abdollahian issued a warning of worse to come if Israel continues with its actions.
I
would like to warn the United States and the Israeli regime that if they do not immediately stop the crime against humanity and genocide in Gaza, anything is possible at any moment, and the region will go out of control. The consequences will fall on the perpetrators and those responsible for this war.
And that warning of the region going out of control coming from a country that backs known terror groups in the region, Hamas and Hezbollah, both of which could threaten Israel in a multi-front war. Already, Israel has been targeting Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and there have also been exchanges of artillery and rocket fire between Israel and Hezbollah militants in southern Lebanon. Not only that, Israel's defense forces have also identified launches coming from across its eastern border with Syria. And joining me now for more from Cairo is journalist Karim Al-Gohari. Karim, I understand you just returned from the Israel-Lebanon border where clashes have occurred between Hezbollah and the Israeli army. How tense is the situation there?
Well, it's obvious that it gets more tense every day, and more tense means more shelling on both sides. But the interesting thing is, it is still what both sides consider the rules of engagement. That means it's all concentrated on the immediate border area on both sides. And even when I was there a few days ago, there's even in the timing, there's a certain rule of engagement. We came there in the early afternoon, and one of the Hezbollah men said to us, don't worry, it will start at 5 o'clock. So there seems to be kind of some mutual rules of engagements that are still considered by both sides. And this is, as long as this way, it's not going to escalate. The escalation will be when one side, or for example, the Hezbollah decides to fire rockets deep into Israel, or if Israel would bombard targets wider inside Lebanon.
And I do want to talk to you about that possible escalation, but first I'd like your views on what is happening there in relation to civilians on both sides of the border. You say that this shelling, there appears to be some sort of an understanding as to when this begins, but what is the impact it's having on civilians?
Well, I can only tell you the civilian side of the Lebanese border, because that's where I've been. What is very obvious that a lot of people left the villages which are deep in the south. I mean, the villages which are in the first, I would say, 10 kilometers range of the border. These villages are quite empty. Families left, and whoever can went to Beirut or to other places in Lebanon, mostly trying to visit relatives, expecting that the situation might escalate. But of course, you find civilians who are still there, and they're definitely preparing for a war. I went to visited one family which kind of showed me how they stocked up on macaroni, on rice, on cooking oil, making always sure that the tank in the car is full. So definitely prepared for something to come. And that they're afraid, but they're also preparing themselves.
You talked about escalation as well in one of your earlier answers. And given that we don't know how this shapes up, one of the fears in Israel, of course, is of a multi-front war that Israel might have to fight. How likely is it, based on your assessment of having been there in that border area, that Hezbollah launches a full-scale assault against Israel in the coming weeks?
Well, it didn't happen when the 7th of October, so there was, in that sense, Hezbollah didn't follow a Hamas lead and opened a second front. The Hezbollah is saying there is a red line, and when that red line is crossed, they will enter the war, but they're not defining this red line. And what is also interesting, we didn't, since the 7th of October, since Hamas attacked southern Israel, we didn't have any public statement from the Hezbollah leader, Hassan Nasrallah, so he keeps himself in the background. Hezbollah keeps itself quite vague if and when they're going to enter this war.
How connected are Hezbollah and Hamas in their aims? I mean, how much is Hezbollah willing to commit to support Hamas in its war against Israel?
Well, that's the big question, right? I mean, one thing is, of course, both are connected to Iran. I would say Hezbollah is even more connected to Iran. So it is also a question what kind of decisions coming out from Tehran on this issue. Hezbollah and Hamas are somehow connected. When we saw this operation on the 7th of October and the way how it was done, the way that the Hamas managed to organize this in secret, seems to be that they are trained now somewhere else. And it might be also that in the training of Hamas, Hezbollah has a hand, because it's very similar, of course, the secrecy around operations is very similar what Hezbollah would do.
You spoke about Iran and the connection with Iran, and you had the Iranian foreign minister just recently issue a warning, essentially saying, I quote, the region will go out of control, unquote, if Israel doesn't stop its assaults on Gaza. How likely is this to happen, the region going out of control?
I think there's a big possibility, and we don't need to always, I mean, we always look at the Gaza Strip in southern Israel. We look at the northern border of Israel and southern Lebanon, Hezbollah. I think what is even more likely to explode is another front, and that is in the West Bank. I mean, we have a really escalation in the West Bank with dozens of Palestinians killed in the last week since the 7th of October. And that's somehow like a steaming cooking pot that's on the fire right now, and everyone is waiting when it's going to explode. And then there's another front, and that is inside Israel. That's the Palestinians inside Israel who have an Israeli nationality and Israeli passport. Also, the question will be what's happening there when there is an Israeli ground attack onto Gaza, and when it becomes more bloody, the situation in Gaza. So there's many potential fronts beyond the one we're now thinking of, and that is Hezbollah and Israel on the northern border.
We'll leave it there for the time being. Thanks so much for bringing us all that context, Karim El-Gouari in Cairo. Thank you so much, sir.
You're welcome.
Israel's war on Hamas is having an impact thousands of miles away in Southeast Asia as well. Here, there have been regular protests in some countries, including Indonesia, against Israel's actions in the region. Indonesia is also the world's largest Muslim-majority country.
Waving Indonesian and Palestinian flags, protesters gathered in large numbers in Jakarta over the weekend to call for an end to Israel's blockade of Gaza and Israeli airstrikes. The action followed an attack on Israel by the terror group Hamas, during which armed men killed at least 1,400 Israeli civilians and took over 200 hostages. Demonstrators marched from several mosques to the heavily guarded US Embassy in Jakarta, denouncing American support for Israel and waving anti-Israel placards. There were protests outside the UN mission and the Indonesian Foreign Affairs Ministry. At the inaugural meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which brings together Arab, Gulf and ASEAN nations, Indonesia's President Joko Widodo strongly criticised Israel and called for a ceasefire. We express our deep concern about the developments in Gaza. The violence must stop. Humanity must be the priority in this moment, and we must prevent things from getting worse. Within ASEAN, there are divided views on Israel. Brunei, Malaysia and Indonesia have expressed unity with the Palestinians, and none of them has diplomatic relations with Israel. Singapore, Thailand and Philippines have less strident views. Indonesian Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi said the countries had condemned all attacks against civilians and called for a durable ceasefire.
I mentioned in my statement, and for all concerned parties to ensure the most effective and efficient access for humanitarian aid and relief supplies and other basic necessity and essential services, as well as restoration of electricity, water and others.
Pro-Palestinian sentiment is widespread in Indonesia, where many see the crisis as a moment to show solidarity with the Muslim world.
Joining me now for more on this from Jakarta is DW Asia Pacific Bureau Chief Georg Martes. Georg, we've seen a number of pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Indonesia since Hamas's terror attack in Israel. What are people demanding?
Well, in recent weeks, Birash particularly had demands to call in for an immediate ceasefire to stop the bombardment. You have regular shows of solidarity of this kind for the Palestinian cause, as we have seen in the report just now. And so you really have a vast spectrum here, from radical views that supposedly Israel is the real terrorist in this conflict, to more moderate views where people would say, look, you can't punish an entire population in Gaza for the terrible deeds that single individual terrorists have done.
What is the position of the Indonesian government here?
Well, first of all, I think one needs to point out that the Indonesian government and Indonesia itself holds no formal diplomatic relations with Israel. And then, of course, every time the civilians are hit by Israeli bombs, then you have strong condemnation from Indonesian public, but also from the Indonesian government and from Indonesian officials. The overall perspective in Indonesia is that the root of the problem of this conflict is the occupation. And that is why Joko Widodo, the president of Indonesia, has just recently called that this must be resolved in accordance with the parameters agreed by the United Nations. Overall, I think it's interesting to see that the support by Indonesia for the Palestinian cause is very much tied to an anti-colonial attitude that is enshrined in the Indonesian constitution. So Indonesians draw a parallel from their colonial history to the current Middle Eastern conflict.
Indonesia is also headed to presidential elections next year. Could the current situation between Israel and Hamas have an impact on those polls?
Well, it's of course a very sensitive issue here, and so you could tell at the earlier this year, for instance, when the U20 World Cup was supposed to take place here, one of the candidates who is now running for president for next year's presidential election here was the main person who asked that Israel would not participate in the U20, although they qualified. And subsequently, the host, that Indonesia as a host for this U20 was cancelled by FIFA. And this gives you an idea how sensitive an issue that is. On the other hand, now all the candidates are pretty much on the same page in support for the Palestinian cause.
I'd like to expand this to other countries in the region as well, Georg, particularly Malaysia, which seems to have taken a particularly pro-Palestinian stand. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, the Prime Minister here of Malaysia came forward and said that more pressure is needed, that more support from other nations, that they should team up and put more pressure on Israel. And I would say if you compare that to the Indonesian stand, then Indonesia has a somewhat more moderate support view. For instance, the terror organization Hamas is never really addressed or mentioned in any official statement from Indonesian officials. And Joko Widodo reiterated lately that their support for the Palestinian cause rests on three pillars, and that is humanitarian aid, trade, and diplomacy.
Our report also looked at the first meeting of ASEAN countries with GCC nations that happened in Riyadh last week. A joint statement was issued, but a number of ASEAN nations such as Indonesia, Malaysia and Brunei don't have official relations with Israel. How united, therefore, is ASEAN on this issue?
Well, it's a big word to say united. When you refer to ASEAN, there's of course different opinions there all the time. And for ASEAN to really get active, you need unanimity. You need everybody on the same page. And if you look at the Myanmar conflict, you already don't have that unity. And so when it comes to a conflict in the Middle East, you clearly have near nations which are predominantly Muslim, like Malaysia and Indonesia. And you have other nations like Vietnam and Thailand who have less commitment on that front, and that is why ASEAN does not have a clear stance on that issue.
We'll leave it there for the time being, but thank you so much for joining us today. Georg Martes, DW Asia Pacific Bureau Chief in Jakarta. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, here in Germany, Chancellor Olaf Scholz has opened a new synagogue in the city of Dessau in the east of the country. Germany has seen a rise in anti-Semitic incidents since the start of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. And that's prompted authorities to tighten security around synagogues and Jewish buildings. Scholz stressed that Germany will do all it can to protect Jewish communities.
Für Antisemitismus darf es in Deutschland keinerlei Toleranz.
There can be no room for anti-Semitism in Germany, regardless of whether it is motivated by politics or religion, whether it is from the left or the right, whether it is festered here for hundreds of years or has been brought in from the outside. Anti-Semitism is a poison feeding from resentment, lack of empathy and intolerance. It is a poison that divides our society and endangers our democracy.
Das unsere Gesellschaft zersetzt und unsere Demokratie gefährdet.
The fight against anti-Semitism is also a fight for a better, more humane, enlightened society, and thus a responsibility of all.
And part of that responsibility was in view at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate on Sunday, where thousands gathered in solidarity with Israel. Among them were relatives of hostages taken by Hamas during its terror attacks 2 weeks ago. Meanwhile, several protesters were arrested at a pro-Palestinian march, which authorities had banned for security reasons.
Coming together in grief, disbelief and resolve. In the heart of Germany's capital, thousands of people from the Jewish and wider communities taking a stand against terror and hatred. It was here in Berlin where one of history's darkest chapters, the Holocaust, was orchestrated. Hamas's terror attacks on October 7 in Israel were the deadliest against Jews since then, something many are struggling to come to terms with.
I think it's important here in the land of the perpetrators to show what side we're on.
I'm very sad about what's happening. Being here is one thing I can do. Apart from that, I feel quite helpless.
I'm sending a very clear sign of my solidarity with Israel.
A sentiment strongly echoed by Germany's President Frank-Walter Steinmeier.
We say to our friends in Israel and to all Jews, you are not alone. We stand by your side in these terrible hours. Your pain is our pain.
Protecting Jewish life is something Germany's government says it has a special responsibility to do. Figures show incidents of anti-Semitism have risen since the Hamas attacks.
While this demonstration here has gone ahead peacefully, local authorities across Germany have banned many pro-Palestinian demonstrations from taking place at all over fears of incitement to anti-Semitic violence.
Nearby, police clash with protesters at an unauthorised pro-Palestinian demonstration, something seen repeatedly in Berlin in recent days. But the bans have led to fierce criticism, many accusing German authorities of censorship and political repression. Some pro-Palestinian demonstrations have gone ahead without incident, as did the Israel Solidarity rally in Berlin. Here, relatives of hostages taken by Hamas pleaded for their safe return and asked those gathered to pass on one special message.
Today is my sister's birthday. Please join me in the simplest song, a happy birthday song, a strong, loud voice of my beloved sister.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Yarden. Happy birthday to you.
As we saw in that report, Germany has banned several pro-Palestinian rallies. We asked our political correspondent Emily Gordine how authorities are justifying that ban and enforcing it.
Well, I mean, we spoke with police spokespeople last week, and they told us that a lot of the times they just draw on their own experience. They say that in the past, pro-Palestinian rallies have led to anti-Semitic hate speech. They have also led to violence in some regards. But of course, that doesn't justify a blanket ban. We also spoke with lawyers here in Berlin, and they say that, of course, on the basis of protecting sort of the inner security, you can in fact ban protests, but to ban all protests or the majority of protests is unlikely to be justified by that argument. And I mean, we've heard from rights groups that they will take legal action against these blanket bans. And of course, they have also led to a lot of frustration among the Palestinian community. Germany is home to one of the largest Palestinian diasporas in Europe, if not the largest diaspora. And a lot of them, will have had families in Gaza, have friends there, and they also want this right to show their solidarity with them and to say, hey, here are innocent civilians that are being killed, and we also want to be able to go on the streets and show our concern for our loved ones.